This is one of the most inhospitable places on our planet. Antarctica, a frozen kingdom. It's 2007, and in the dead of night, a red cruise ship plunges ahead through ice and slush, engines rumbling as she makes slow headway. Aboard are around 154 passengers and crew, most of them tucked warmly away in their beds. They've got well used to the rhythmic throb of the engines and the occasional rattle of dense ice along the hull. But no fear, this cruise ship has been designed specifically for this, reinforced for just this kind of voyage. She should be impervious, but then there's a deep groan, a bang. Her reinforced hull is torn open by the ice as easily as a tin can, and within hours, it's all over. Passengers are set adrift in open-top lifeboats in one of the planet's most dangerous environments. Rescue seems like a forlorn hope. The Explorer had been built to operate in the ice. She had done so successfully for nearly 4 decades. The ship had been built based on lessons from the past, and yet it had happened again. Ice had cut her hull and sent her to the bottom. How this saga played out and the series of events that sank a modern cruise ship in waters it was specifically designed to conquer stands as a fascinating warning and a reminder to us that nature is still always in control. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Ocean Liner Designs, and this is the harrowing true story of the sinking of the MV Explorer. Begins in the late 1960s as a new form of tourism is beginning to gain rapid popularity. Once, ships were useful only for carrying people between the world's continents, but by the 1960s, the jet airliner had taken over, and the great ocean liners disappeared almost overnight. But big passenger-carrying ships found a new popular purpose: cruising. Former liners carried people to beautiful sunny destinations like Hawaii and the Canary Islands alike. But there was another kind of market that was emerging: adventure tourism. The idea that passengers could be taken deliberately to far-flung and exotic destinations was a new and exciting one. An immediately attractive option were the poles, the Arctic and the Antarctic. These spectacular frozen landscapes were a natural draw for tourists around the world, but with virtually no infrastructure like hotels and restaurants on land, the only obvious way to see the glaciers, the icy mountains and the waddling penguins was from the warm safety of a ship. For a time, cruises were run on converted merchant vessels, but in the late 1960s, a Swedish-American entrepreneur named Lars-Erik Lindblad thought that a purpose-built cruise ship would blow the potential polar adventure cruise market wide open. He'd already had a string of successes running other exotic cruises to the Falklands, the Seychelles, and many more, but the draw of Antarctica among his customer base was clearly evident. He commissioned a ship almost 240 feet, or 73 metres long, and about 2,400 tonnes, really little larger than most luxury super yachts. But the small size of the ship had an advantage for the intended cruise location. She would be manoeuvrable, able to more easily weave her way through patches of dense ice on the surface in an area where a larger ship would struggle to do the same. Now, this new ship had to obviously feature some special design considerations because of the onerous nature of its intended role and the danger of the environment. Now here, we need to step away for a minute and just talk about the history of ships and their encounters with the ice. For most ships, a run-in with the ice is a death sentence, plain and simple, and it's been that way for hundreds and hundreds of years. In the glory days of sail, uncountable numbers of fast clipper ships and barks simply disappeared with all passengers and crew last sighted, they said, in the regions of known ice fields. There were a series of increasingly more worrying collisions into the early 20th century as ships got larger and faster, and then came Titanic. To this day, people doubt that an iceberg could have cut through the ship's hull like it did, but bergs are not made of the same stuff that you can find floating around in your whiskey. They are often ancient, harder than rock, displacing hundreds of thousands or even millions of tons of water. The biggest ice giants are immovable. They are floating islands of ship-killing terror. But, fortunately, lessons had been taken away from the Titanic disaster. For one, in the Atlantic, the International Ice Patrol tracks all the large bergs that carve off of glaciers from the north. But there are regions of the world's oceans that the Ice Patrol simply cannot observe. And then, in 1959, it happened again. In a storm, the Danish passenger cargo liner the Hans Hedtoft was on her maiden voyage when she encountered an iceberg that popped open her riveted hull and sank her quickly. There were no survivors, and the ship simply disappeared. All that was left was this one lifebuoy. So here, in 1969, 10 years after the Hedtoft, is a ship being specifically designed to operate in a berg and ice-rich environment. So how do you protect such a ship? For one, there was the ship's hull itself, the most important part of the structure, intended to be actually in contact with the ice. The ship was built with a hull rated to so-called 1C Finnish-Swedish ice class. So this meant, with her hull shell plating no thinner than 13mm or about half an inch, she'd be able to maintain a speed of about 5 knots in a waterway with around 0.6 meters or 23 inches of ice. Now, for reference, that kind of hull thickness, 13mm, is usually reserved for passenger ships and vessels 5 or 10 times larger. With all that extra steel and having a need to push through the dense ice, her engines also needed to pack a punch. So in the machinery spaces were fitted a pair of diesels, each outputting 1,800 horsepower for the usual array of electrical generators and such, but mainly for the single screw, which could actually reverse the pitch or the angle of its blades for the ship to run backwards or astern. Now, just in case something went wrong, the vessel's watertight compartment system was designed so that she should stay afloat with any 2 of her compartments flooded. This was the first custom-built luxury expedition cruise ship, and she was named Lindblad Explorer after her proud owner. The ship, eventually renamed to simply Explorer in 1992, had a very impressive, very lively career for such a relatively small vessel. Naturally, she established a series of firsts. The first purpose-built expedition cruise ship, the first cruise ship to navigate the Northwest Passage, the first ship to circumnavigate James Ross Island, and the first ship to sail to the origin of the Amazon River. Now, clearly, Explorer was making a name for herself, and her years spent exploring the globe earned her an enviable reputation. But soon, the Little Red Ship, as many lovingly called her, would earn her final and her most dubious distinction of all by becoming the first cruise ship to sink in polar waters. In November 2007, Explorer set out for an exciting trip. This was designed to retrace the steps of the famous polar explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton. Over the course of 19 days, passengers would enjoy a trip that would take them from Argentina out to the Falklands, South Georgia and Sandwich Islands, then down through the Drake Passage into the frozen world of Antarctica. The passengers on board were probably oblivious to the heated debates that were taking place within the polar exploration community about this exact type of voyage. Explorer was a specially designed ship, but in the decades since she had been built, over nearly 40 years earlier, more and more cruise ships had entered the market and crowded the Antarctic waterways. But few of these were properly ice-rated. Now this was a recipe for disaster, and a few people actually predicted it. A 2006 paper by Professors Emma J. Stewart and Diane Draper had warned about the increased numbers of cruise ships in dangerous polar waters, especially those that weren't properly ice-strengthened. For Explorer's part, that ship had her ice rating actually improved over the course of her career. As a 1A rated ship, she could, in theory, maintain 5 knots through ice a meter or nearly 40 inches thick. But only if it was non-consolidated, something which is called first-year ice. Consolidated ice features layers of ice that have melted and then refrozen, but this actually hardens the ice and strengthens or consolidates it, freeze bonding the mass together. Now obviously, this kind of ice is a ship's worst nightmare, but in Explorer's 4-decade-long career, she had navigated the polar ice safely, save for 2 incidents where the ship was grounded. Explorer set out and called at the stops following in the Shackleton expedition's footsteps, and passengers were delighted to see the windswept Falklands, the remote Sandwich Islands, and then, at last, the towering white glaciers and snow-capped Rocky Mountains of Antarctica. Passengers were joined by cruise line tour operators who could take them out on inflatable small boats called Zodiacs for fun tours of the coasts, the small rivers, and the glacial formations where the ship couldn't reach. On November 18th, passengers explored a remote stretch of South Georgia Island on the Zodiacs. On November 21st, day 11 of the cruise, 49-year-old Captain Bengt Weimann looked out of his stateroom window and noted a field of ice looming ahead of his ship. Now, he wasn't concerned. Explorer had already skirted an ice field 2 days earlier. Just earlier, Weimann had actually altered his ship's course to avoid the worst of the ice, but now it seemed he'd need to cut his way through it. As the sun set, Explorer's searchlights lit the path ahead, and she began to cut her way through the field. With speed reduced from 12 knots to 5, Explorer crawled on. Captain Weimann was new to his role as captain, and this was his first voyage in command in these waters, but he was not new to the ship. Weimann had more than 20 years of experience at sea, and in fact, he had previously been Explorer's chief officer. Now he watched from the bridge as the ship's searchlights lit up the broken ice ahead. He wasn't worried though, because he had judged the ice to just be first-year ice, exactly what Explorer was designed to motor through. The ice rattled and scraped along the hull, but all seemed well. With passengers tucked asleep in their bunks, the hours ticked by. But then, after midnight, Explorer was brought to a sudden stop. At that slow speed, it wasn't unusual for a formation of denser ice to halt the ship. And the captain had a routine for this, where he would simply reverse his vessel and then start forward again to batter her way through. Explorer ran her propeller astern and surged forward, slowly making her way ahead, but then a single alarm rang on the bridge. This was a passenger cabin alarm, and the bridge crew thought it had been accidentally triggered by the cabin's occupants. But, just in case, an able seaman was sent below to figure out why it might have sounded, and a few minutes later, the captain received a chilling call. Down on deck 3, there was flooding in passenger cabin 314 on what was Explorer's lowest passenger deck. The cabin sat amidships, almost at the ship's very centre, some 100-odd feet back from the tip of the bow. And just before, 2 passengers had been asleep in their bunks when an unusually heavy impact had dented in the side plating so violently it had pinched one passenger's fingers between his bunk and the ship's side. They were alarmed by the sound of running water, and they turned on their light to find a foot of water already on the floor. As they explained themselves, the investigating sailor received a strange request from the bridge to taste the water. If it was fresh, then it could simply be a broken water pipe leaking into the room, but a taste revealed the water was salty. It was coming from outside the ship, and it was already knee-high. The captain rushed below to check for himself and found the flooding around his feet. Somehow, Explorer had been whole, her reinforced hull torn through by the ice regardless. It had started a ticking clock that meant if the flooding couldn't be stemmed, then the ship would be lost, and the 150-odd people on board would be stranded in the middle of the black Antarctic night. Captain Weimann wasn't going to waste any time. He made an urgent announcement calling for the crew damage control party to assemble on deck 3, and then sounded the general alarm. Through the cabins, a series of tones, 7 short and 1 long, woke sleeping passengers up, and announcements urged them to don warm clothing and gather in the Penguin Lounge to await for further instruction. This was just a precaution. Captain Weimann and his crew wanted to fight to save their ship. Water surged in down on deck 3, and the damage control party got to work. It wasn't just cabin 314, passengers in cabin 310 and 312 had been woken by the impact too, and they'd been just as alarmed to see water dribbling down the bulkheads and pooling on their floors. A check in cabin 308 found the same thing. This presented the damage control party with a challenge because clearly Explorer's shell plating, her outer skin, had been ruptured for some distance, perhaps as much as 15 to 25 feet. The battle to save the ship had already begun. First, the engineering crew rigged pumps and began to discharge floodwater over the side. In cabin 314, the water level began to slowly drop as the pumps dealt with the flow, but then in the engine control room, an alarm sounded. Water was flooding down from the decks above, and the engineers could see it flowing down the bulkheads and the walls. Now clearly, this was very bad. They started their main fire pumps in an effort to drain it from the vital engine rooms, and to preserve the ship's electrical power, watertight doors to the generator room were shut. Back in cabin 314, crewmen struggled to find the source of the flooding. They used wrenches and tools to force decorative panels away and then move the entire bunk, but still to no avail. In desperation, and with their hands badly numbed by the freezing water, they attacked the panels with a fire axe in an attempt to break through to the shell plating behind it. Feeling aside the panelling, a crewman at last was able to feel water surging in through what he described as a fist-sized hole. Thinking quickly, they jammed bedding into the hole and forced it shut with plywood and a metal bar to maintain the pressure. With the flow stemmed and the pumps at work, the water level began to decrease and it seemed like the flooding was under control. The captain was relieved. So relieved, he made his way up to the Penguin Lounge where his concerned passengers were crowded about, dressed in heavy coats and bright orange life vests. He calmed them and let them know that all was in hand. Meanwhile, a distress call had been sent and received. One benefit of the surge in popularity with Antarctic tourism is that Explorer was not alone out there that night, and that a handful of expedition and cruise ships were within range to help. One of the first to pick up the message was one of Explorer's old Lindblad fleetmates, then called National Geographic Endeavour. Like Explorer, she was a small expedition cruise ship, and Captain Vyman called her up via satellite phone to explain the situation, and for National Geographic Endeavour to make all speed for Explorer's location. The express coastal ship Nord-Norge, usually employed as a kind of ferry, but then employed as an Antarctic cruise ship during off-seasons, rushed to the position as well. So did a Chilean icebreaker. They were still hours away, but at least Explorer's passengers and crew knew that help was on the way, even if the flooding had already, apparently, been stemmed. Back up on deck, the captain organised for one of the Zodiac expedition boats to be lowered over the side for a visual inspection of the hull. Now, the theory was that if damage could actually be sighted from the outside of the ship, that a tarpaulin could be rigged so it would sit flush and be drawn into the actual hull itself by the water pressure and kind of plug the gap. The Zodiac splashed out into the darkness, but no damage could be seen. Not only that, but the tarpaulin couldn't be pulled taut enough over the hull to cover any of the damage in the first place. Explorer began to list to one side. Clearly, the flooding hadn't been stemmed, and it was simply pooling elsewhere deep inside, likely a voluminous empty fuel tank below cabin 314. A surefire sign appeared in the engine room. The trickle of water from above had turned into a steady stream. Even more alarmingly, the watertight door to the generator room was leaking. Water was pouring in through the seals at the top of the door. The ocean water began to flood the separator room, which presented immediate, serious danger. Now, if the main circuit breaker panel in there shorted out, it would set off a chain reaction that would see crucial generators and pumps fail that provide fuel to the ship's main engines and the emergency generators. It would essentially leave the Explorer afloat with just 15 or 20 minutes of power. Explorer would be blackened out, adrift, and alone. The engine room crew got to work battling to manually transfer the fuel to the generators themselves, but then, about 2:15 AM, the remaining fuel in the gravity feed tanks ran out, and the engines needed to be shut down immediately, lest the generator's fuel supply be cut off entirely. The ship was plunged suddenly into darkness. With the Explorer now leaning sharply to one side, and with only dim emergency lighting illuminating the corridors and the stairs, Captain Vyman's earlier sense of relief was replaced with profound worry. So too was that of the passengers, who just minutes prior had been told that all was well. Now, an evacuation of the ship seemed a certainty. Urgent radio calls down to the engine room made the plan clear. The engines needed to come back online because Explorer needed to be manoeuvred out of the ice field so the lifeboats could be lowered over the ship's side. If they tried it in the ice field, the boats could actually be fouled in their launch and capsized with disastrous effect. Remarkably, this purpose-built polar exploration ship had been fitted with a pathetic array of 4 open-top lifeboats, which could provide virtually no protection or shelter whatsoever from the poor weather or freezing cold, both conditions which Explorer was expected to regularly encounter during her service. After nearly a half hour of battling with the machinery, the engineers were able to start the generators and return power to the ship's lights and main propulsion, specifically her bow thruster. This was what the captain wanted to use to maneuver his ship away from the ice field and into a clear sea surface where the boats could be loaded and launched. Wyman still didn't think Explorer was going to sink and that evacuation was just a precaution, And as the engineers got the pumps going again down in the engine room, the lifeboats were at last swung out and the passengers began to board. Now, taking to the boats in the darkness like that was not the kind of fun activity that Explorer's passengers had been promised. There was no rescue ship in sight, just icy blackness all around. Here was where organisational problems began to rear their heads. Nobody knew their assigned boat because they hadn't been told where to go in an evacuation beyond the Penguin Lounge muster station. The passengers went from boat to boat, just looking for a blank spot where they might be able to fit in. It was not a pretty scene. Crew yelled and shouted at one another. And worst of all, the lifeboat's engines wouldn't start. Passengers were loaded into the tragically antiquated open-top boats, every breath visible on the chill air, but even taking to the lifeboats was not a guarantee for survival. If a blow came on or the seas rose, the boats would scatter and be forced to contend with the Antarctic's icy seas with no real roof for protection. As it turned out, the lifeboats were kitted out with a flimsy screen that was stored away. This could be erected and put up, but the crew either forgot about them or didn't know how to use them, because none of them were put up at all. There was a brief scene of panic as Lifeboat 3 hit the water, but struggled to push off from the Explorer's hull, and then directly above them, Lifeboat 1 hung paused as if she was about to come down right on top of them. There was an urgent struggle to push away before disaster struck. Fortunately, the boat slowly moved out of Lifeboat 1's path. On the other side, lifted high into the air by the list, Lifeboat 2 rattled down the ship's hull so alarmingly that most inside thought it was going to capsize and the boat might tip them out. They had every reason to be panicked. This exact same scenario had played out with devastating effect on such sinking ships as the Empress of Ireland and the Lusitania nearly a century before. Unfortunately, the sea state that night was initially fairly calm, so the lifeboats plopped down into the water as if it was just one more happy excursion outing. There was a telltale sign that not all was well. The Explorer was, by this point, listing over to about 15 degrees, and walking from one side of the ship to the other was like walking up a steep hill. Now, down in the engine rooms, the battle to save the Explorer was slowly being lost. Despite the pumps and the engineers both working overtime, the water level slowly continued to rise thanks to the water surging in from the deck above. It slowly rose until Generator 3 began to be submerged. For safety, it had to be shut down. Inspections of the deck above showed water pouring out through toilets and flooding the entire deck. The actual holes in the hull still couldn't be found. Agonizingly, slowly, the Explorer was being flooded by an invisible series of punctures, and the math was simple. More water was coming in than the pumps could push out. It meant that Explorer was doomed. The battle was over, and the ship was going to sink. With all the lifeboats away and every passenger accounted for, the chief engineer made his way to the bridge to report to the captain what he probably already knew. The Explorer was lost. The captain acted right away and recalled every single engineer who was still down in the flooding machinery spaces. Without ceremony, the party of engineers rigged the excursion Zodiacs, boarded them, and left the captain and a small party of officers aboard the bridge. They wanted to try to stay behind on Explorer until the rescue ships could arrive, just in case the vessel could be saved. But then, the unexpected happened. With all of Explorer's engineering crew off the ship in their Zodiac boats, Explorer's variable pitch propeller reversed pitch and began to run full astern. The ship began to move, tracing a wide, slow arc through the black water, moving backwards and wallowing like some kind of sad whale. The captain and his officers rushed to shut the engines down, but their kill switch in the bridge did nothing. They called out the engineers and the Zodiacs to come help, but realized that with the Explorer careening out of control, it would be too dangerous to even try to approach her. With a heavy heart, Captain Vyman and the remaining crew gathered on the bow, boarded a Zodiac alongside, and left Explorer behind them, heeling over to a sharp 20 degrees of list. With Explorer finally abandoned, the passengers and crew had to take their chances in their open-top boat, adrift in the ocean with no help on hand. To their dismay, the calm sea began to develop a slight chop, which sprayed them with cold seawater. Only one main boat's engine even started. The other three were joined by the Zodiacs, who could take them under tow. Thermal blankets stored inside the boats had their zippers rusted shut. They tore when people tried to use them, or they simply did nothing at all to protect against the biting cold. As the chop worsened, dozens of passengers became seasick and the ship's doctor worked from boat to boat to try to help. The sun began to rise over the Antarctic Sea, and after having spent a freezing, bumpy, uncomfortable night in their open-top boats, a helicopter at last roared overhead with the promise of a rescue to come. It was an exciting sight to the people crammed into the small boats, and then, on the horizon, a searchlight was spotted. It was the Nordnorge and the National Geographic Endeavour. They had worked through the night to rush to the scene, and finally, at 6:25 a.m, the explorers' lifeboats came alongside the reassuringly tall hulls of their rescue ships. Rescue itself wasn't an easy task. Transferring people from the small Zodiacs to the boats and then to the ships called for some delicate maneuvers in the choppy seas. But the rescue could not have been better timed. Just hours after all were safe and sound aboard, a gale roared through that would probably have overwhelmed and sunk Explorer's little lifeboats in no time at all. Remarkably, Explorer remained afloat for hours, drifting sadly and leaning heavily over. She was photographed by aircraft from above. Then that night, nearly a full day after the initial impact, Explorer was finally overwhelmed and sank to a depth of about 600 meters, or nearly 2,000 feet, below. Lindblad's intrepid little cruise ship, the expedition vessel that had brought so much joy to people over 40 years, was gone. So, what had happened? Well, in 2006, some professors had actually predicted that a cruise ship could be lost under these exact circumstances. But what was shocking was that it was Explorer, probably the most qualified ship to be operating in the area, that had been lost. An exhaustive investigation was launched that resulted in a nearly 100-page final report that found a number of deficiencies in the ship's handling. But first and foremost, it actually praised the crew's concern for the safety of the passengers and for their battle to save the ship. The engineers had worked like lions to keep Explorer afloat. The captain had treated the situation with the seriousness it deserved too. Mustering the passengers right away was the right call, and abandoning the ship had been done as well as could be expected despite the initial confusion. If they had waited any longer, then the boats on the high port side couldn't have been used at all, and the evacuation would have needed to take place with Explorer running 8 knots backwards. It's likely one or more boats would have been swamped and lost. Dozens could have died. The rescue itself was perfectly timed. It was thought that had the rescue ships not arrived for another hour or two, then passengers would have been lost thanks to hypothermia. It was just that cold. Why had the ship run itself astern anyway? Well, it seems that the captain and officers, as they remained on the bridge, may have kept the ship's engines moving slow ahead to try to keep her bow into the waves or maybe maneuver her clear of the ice field. But then hydraulic pressure in the variable pitch propeller system had dropped thanks to the flooding, and the blades simply shifted angles thanks to the force of water over them. Explorer began to move backwards. The ship's watertight compartment scheme should have saved her, but the investigation concluded that the watertight doors had failed thanks to small leaks caused by improper maintenance or slight damage. The water had flooded through the halls and seeped through the sewage system and into ducts down into the engine rooms below, meaning it was impossible for her engineers to save her. In the end, the investigation was scathing of Captain Wyman's judgment leading up to the disaster. He had plenty of experience at sea, but had never actually captained a vessel into Antarctic waters. But he had plenty more experience in the Baltic, where conditions are different, specifically the type of ice ships are expected to encounter. He had observed the ice field ahead and judged it to simply be first-year ice, relatively soft ice that Explorer could safely punch her way through. But reports and subsequent analysis suggest this may have been the wrong call, that scrappy clumps of small icebergs called growlers may hide, just below the surface, shelves of dense land ice from glaciers with complex refrozen layers in between. This is the stuff that's harder than rock. It can slice easily through the steel hull of a ship. Explorer had been brought to a sudden stop by something large and dense below. It seems likely that a hidden pack of consolidated ice had arrested her in her tracks and punctured her hull plating with ease. In his defense, Captain Wyman said he had no other choice than to punch his way through the ice field because Explorer was only about 4.5 miles away from reaching open water and safety. But this confidence seems misplaced. The report draws attention to the captain's own testimony when he said he felt confident as he had a, quote, fully ice-classed vessel in my hands, which seems to indicate a reductive understanding of explorers' ice handling capabilities at best. The captain and crew did make one very large oversight. In their hurried escape from the ship, they neglected to remove the voyage data recorder, the ship's equivalent of an airplane black box. Without this crucial piece of information, conclusions had to be drawn on the sinking based solely off of recollections and fragments of video footage. Based on all the evidence they could gather, the investigation lay the blame at Captain Wyman's feet, all stemming from that initial decision to enter the ice field. He shouldn't have attempted to transit the field in the dark, and even when he did enter the field, it's thought that he should have slowed Explorer down even further. The report concluded with the observation that if Wyman had been trained for Antarctic conditions specifically, then he probably would not have decided to tackle the ice field in the dark at all. Thanks equally to the crew's fast actions, the rescue ship's proximity, and the sheer good fortune of the calm conditions, a serious loss of life was averted. If just one of those three things had been different, most, if not all, of Explorer's passengers and crew would have been lost. Today, cruise tourism to the poles continues to steadily grow as people rush to have the opportunity to see some of the true last frontier wilderness of our planet. The story of the Explorer should stand as a reminder to all operators and owners of ships that complacency kills, and in such dangerous waters as the polar seas, there is absolutely no margin for error.